Hi, my name is Don Newton, and welcome to my documentary about Prohibition. In this documentary, I'll be explaining to you why Prohibition began, the negative and positive effects of it, the gang violence that occurred from Prohibition, all the bootlegging and illegal sales of alcohol that occurred, the Valentine's Day Massacre and how violent and bloody of an event that was. I will talk about the cops and how they was not able to enforce the Prohibition and how corrupt some of them was. And finally, I'll be explaining to you how Prohibition ended. I will start off by telling you about why Prohibition began. Prohibition began in the years 1920 and ended in the year 1933. This was also known as the Roaring Twenties for the United States. Prohibition was also known as the Noble Experiment. It was known as the Noble Experiment because its goal was to keep families together and get rid of or eliminate alcohol abuse altogether. These were noble goals written by the United States. The United States reason for prohibition was to improve health and hygiene for its U.S. citizens, reduce tax burden created by prisoners, solve social problems, and finally to reduce crime. But also, we wanted prohibition so we could, the resources used to make alcohol, we could ship those overseas to help feed our soldiers, and we wanted a better life for our kids to live in. That way, they don't have to be surrounded by alcohol abuse. But this would lead into much more problems, as I will show here. Prohibition caused many problems, such as rise in organized crime with illegal production and the sale of alcohol. It also caused the decline in tax revenue for the United States, because alcohol and whiskey manufacturers were unable to produce alcohol during this time, unless it was for medical use only. Therefore, it also led to loss in jobs for many people, because those people who worked at those manufacturers had to be cut because they was not able to be worked. It also created a lot more gangs, such as Al Capone's gang and the North Side Chicago gang, which I will go into here really soon. But first, I want to mention a quote. Prohibition only drives drunkenness behind doors and into dark places. It does not cure it or demolish it. Mark Twain. Now, let's move into some more positive thoughts about Prohibition. Prohibition decreased violent crime. Public drunkenness dropped when Prohibition was passed by the House. And finally, workers spent more money on their families instead of spending it on alcohol and products such, including whiskey, wine, and all that stuff. But now, let's move into some gang violence. Gang violence was a big problem in the 1920s, during the Prohibition era. More than 1,000 people in New York alone were killed from gang violence. Gangs were formed and some even got stronger from being able to bootleg alcohol because of Prohibition. But the most famous bootlegger of all was Al Capone. Al Capone was a mob boss. He operated in bootlegging from 1925 to 1931. And keep in mind that Prohibition ended in 1933. He dominated organized crime for many brutal acts and murders. They estimate that Al Capone was to be blamed for over 200 murders. His most famous murder was the Valentine's Day Massacre, which I will get into next. But ultimately, Al Capone went to jail not for murder, but for tax fraud, because that was the only thing he could pin him on. But now, let's go into the Valentine's Day Massacre. Al Capone was in charge of the Valentine's Day Massacre. He sent 4 of his men dressed as police officers to the Lincoln Park, Chicago garage on February 19th, 1929, or Valentine's Day. He sent 4 of his men up there to kill what he thought was going to be Bugs Moran, but ultimately, Bugs Moran was not in those 7 people. Those 7 people were murdered because they were affiliated with the Chicago North Side Gang, which was led by Bugs Moran. They used Tommy guns to drop them dead, with all 7 members had no weapons. So, hence why it's called a massacre. This moves me on to my next topic of the Tommy gun. The Thomas submachine gun, also known as the Tommy gun, was a submachine gun that was very easily bought in the 1920s and 1930s and shot 600 to 700 rounds per minute. The firing rate of it was 164 yards and the length of it was 33.7 inches, including a suppressor to make the gun quieter. It was affordable also. It costed $200 back in 1920, but is equivalent to $3,000 today. which is why gang members like Al Capone and Bugs Moran liked to buy them so often, and it was so commonly used back in the 1920s and 1930 era of Prohibition. My next point of interest will be the corruption of the cops during the Prohibition era. There were roughly 1,500 agents to enforce Prohibition across the whole country. That is less than 30 law enforcement per state. That is not enough law enforcement to handle such a big topic as Prohibition. They had very little or no training at all to handle such a big matter as Prohibition. And because of this, many accepted bribes to ignore the illegal sale of alcohol, or in some cases, they even traded letting them free in exchange for alcohol. Some of them did this because of the very low pay they were given, because the United States was not wanting to give the law enforcement enough pay to handle Prohibition. But this will lead me into my next topic of the reason that we got rid of Prohibition. On December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified by Franklin D. Roosevelt. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, which was Prohibition. The United States government did this because of the Great Depression following the end of the 1920s and the stock market crash in 1929. A lot of political leaders at the time pushed for the Prohibition to end, which was ultimately passed by the House, the Senate, and signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt. In doing so, it gave the United States more tax revenue because people was buying alcohol, which was more taxes for the United States. It stopped a lot of gang violence, such as Al Capone and Bugs Moran, and finally, it stopped the corruption of cops. So, this has been my documentary on Prohibition. I hope you enjoyed, and maybe I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.
You're warned of the day